Thanks for joining us. This is Ears to Hear, a podcast brought to you by the 25th Street Church of Christ in Columbus, Indiana. Check us out online at 25thstreetchurchofchrist.com for directions and meeting times. We appreciate you tuning in. Now, let's get into God's Word with Ears to Hear. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast this week, Having Ears to Hear. As usual, my name is John Hines. I am the preacher for the Church of Christ in Columbus, my co-host.
And it's Andrew Walker. Good to be here again.
Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
We're doing pretty well. Also this week we have a guest accompanying us. We have Grant Byers with us.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
Grant is one of the young fellows here in the congregation here in Columbus, and he asked if he could sit in, and he's just coming straight from work, so I thought that would be fitting because we are going to be talking about work today, and I wouldn't say Grant's a workaholic. We are going to be talking about workaholics, but he's a working fella, and he's straight in from work, and we appreciate him being on the podcast. Andrew, what are we talking about? I said work. What aspect of work?
Yeah, well, like you said, for the record, I work too, John. But
further for the record, I work too.
That's right. We've all had busy days. What we wanted to talk about today was something that I've heard a lot of discussion about in my workplace. I don't know if that's true for every workplace, but I kind of work in a office environment, corporate environment. But one of the common topics that gets circled around is the concept of work-life balance, and it's kind of business speak in a way, and there's usually some slick presentations that go along with it, but the idea is managing your time and managing your energy between your work responsibilities and other responsibilities. So I thought maybe we could look at that from a bit of a Christian perspective. Of course, those kind of topics are more focused on just kind of wellness and general balance in life. They don't really come at it from a Christian angle. But for the Christian, I think there's arguably even more that we ought to be considering in addition to just what we put into our work. And I thought first we might start by saying, that work is necessary. We all need to work, and we need to be busy because there are responsibilities that we need to fulfill that work accomplishes. And the Bible's clear about this. Just thinking about the idea of needing to work to eat, to be provided for. Those are clear themes and clear concepts in Scripture.
And the very fact that you have those issues like this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 at verse 11, that they were urged to aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind their own business, and to work with their own hands, as they were commanded that they could walk properly towards those who are outside, and that they would lack nothing. The very fact that you have verses like that shows there were people living back then that were not working, mm-hmm. that were not taking care of their own needs. They were, one hates to use the word mooching, but I can't think of a better one at this time. They were not working. They were lazy. They were being slothful. And Paul says, listen, this is what the Lord wants us to do. And it's not rocket science. Grant, you worked today. Why did you work?
In hopes that I'm getting a paycheck tomorrow.
Right? You got bills to pay. And
yeah, kind of.
You got your bills to pay.
Yeah, I was say I live with my parents, so I don't have too much to pay. Car insurance and a truck payment, but that's about it.
Yeah. I mean, I know you got a new truck. Well, new to you.
Yeah.
Had a little bit of a fender bender few weeks ago, and it's like, you got bills, and rather than someone else paying your bills, it's like, this is what the Lord says: work with your own hands, do this so that, first off, I don't even know if you would even say first off, that you may lack nothing, that this is how we see to our needs. I mean, I know it's not rocket science, but still a lot of folks even come up short with that. But that's not really, we didn't really want to talk about slothfulness today. We want to talk about the balance there, because what ends up happening, and I've been speaking about this beforehand, most people, if you ask them, hey, do you want to work overtime? What's their answer?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. The bigger the paycheck, the better. So when I worked at the factory, it was the norm that you had people working 72, 84, 96 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
And they would work all they could. And the question is that right? Would you say that's, Andrew, would you say that's fair, that's the question?
I think that is kind of the question that we wanted to hone in on a little bit. Just to kind of go back to the verse that you brought up, there's even other benefits associated with work. I think the idea of a simple life, it kind of points to the idea of being satisfied in doing something, to feel a sense of accomplishment in one's work. But like we said, work has a role to fulfill. It's about, being able to provide for one's needs, one's expenses, or just the needs of life. And to satisfy our physical appetites, we need to work to be able to do that. Proverbs 16:26 was one verse that I'd kind of looked at, which takes the idea of appetite as being the motivator for work, but one that, if we think about it, can keep growing. And in verse 26, Proverbs 16, it says, "A worker's appetite works for him; his mouth urges him on." So there's things that we need, and that drives us to work. But once our needs are met, once our needs are fulfilled, kind of like what you said about the whole overtime thing, most people want to keep going. And most people, when given the opportunity, will keep on trying to attain more because they allow their appetite to grow. And we get used to the level of work that we're at. We get used to the level of income that we're at. And then we start thinking about, what could be next? What could I do if I made 10% more or 20% more than what I'm making now? And we start kind of running those scenarios through our minds, and pretty soon our appetite has grown to where we think now we hunger for more.
Yeah, and I think people take that for granted, probably. And I don't think it's right, but that is what happens. It happens physically. The more we eat, it's like the more we eat, our stomach stretches out. And therefore, the more we can eat. And I think it's the same way with this. I remember when I started working, and I was working at Arby's, of all places, making $4.25 an hour. And I thought I was living the life, because I was making $4.25 an hour. And then I got moved up at some point to assistant manager. And it's funny, every step of the way, as my income grows, as income grew, guess what else grew? The bills grew. And at some point you have to stop and say, whoa, do I really need a 5,000 square foot house with a 5-car garage with who knows what? I mean, at some point you say, what do I really need? And you run smack dab into a verse in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Now godliness with contentment is great gain. And I think one of the things that we're talking about is contentment.
Mm-hmm.
Because frankly, in this country, and I guess the world, how many people are really content with what they have? Not many. Not many. And it's, we brought nothing into this world. It is certain we can carry nothing out. Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. So here I am. I'm the senior one of the three of us. I'm in my lower 40s. Andrew, how old are you?
Mid-20s.
Grant?
Early 20s.
Early 20s. So you're just getting going. Like I said, you're living at home. And certainly, it's like at some point, your bills are going to increase even more.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
I
as you
fully understand that.
So I don't think it's wrong to recognize that fact.
Yes.
By any stretch of the imagination. So... But at some point you have to get into, okay, there has to be a balance.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, Andrew, where do we want to go from there?
Yeah. Well, I think what we've been talking about I kind of was thinking about what are some of the things that, let's just call it workaholism or overworking syndrome, wanting to keep working. What are some of the things that it starts to take away from? Because what we find, and we've been discussing this, I think, with a lot of the episodes that we've talked about so far, we kind of keep coming back to this topic of moderation. And I think what we find is this is one of those categories. We have a finite supply of time. We have a finite supply of energy. Something has to give up more time in order for us to spend more time working. So it's all about what are we pulling our time away from if we're so focused on our work. And what we've been talking about, I think, goes around the first one I had written down, which is greed, or the idea of wanting to constantly grow and have more even when our needs are met. We keep expanding our appetite to what we don't have yet.
I mean, it's the parable of the foolish farmer. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger, and say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. There's a fellow, he actually stops working.
Right.
But it's like, dude, what are you doing? And his mind was not where it needed to be because he was not rich towards God. But I guess you would have to say he was industrious, but it's an odd parable.
It would be sorely missing the mark, I think, if we looked at that parable and the only thing we saw was the commendability of his work ethic or how good he was at making money. There's some people, I think, they look at someone who gets ahead and all they see is someone who's good at making money, but you don't know what that person has given up.
In the name of greed.
In the name of getting to where they are, yeah. Right. So, what are they going without? What are they putting away to have that measure of success?
So as we think about this work balance, I know, Andrew, you have something special coming up at the beginning of August. What is it?
I'm getting married.
Oh, man, Andrew's getting married. So he's looking forward to that. And I know, Grant, you have a special lady friend down south.
Oh, yeah. I won't be able to make it to the wedding because I'll be down in Georgia that weekend.
Yep. So he has a girl down in Georgia. And it just makes you think about, one of the things you'll hear people say is, well, sometimes sacrifices have to be made. And they will work themselves to the bone, and they'll say, well, sacrifices have to be made. And you have to back up and you have to ask the question, well, what is it that's being sacrificed? Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of times family. Family is being sacrificed. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's talking about marriage and it's talking about the marital relationship, but there's a concept here. When it says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise the wife to her husband. I think a lot of husbands and wives, they may share the same house, but they are so busy going all the time that they never spend time with each other. Mm-hmm. And family gets sacrificed.
Right.
And it's like, there's got to be a balance.
And we're not talking about, use your 2 weeks vacation wisely and, spend it with your family. Yeah. Don't leave it up to your employer to determine what's the appropriate amount of attention to show to a spouse or to your children or to your family. Because I would say that usually an employer's motivations are not going to be the same as your family's.
And I mean, you can work yourself to the bone and you can have all sorts of money, but if Grant, let's just look into the future, 5-10 years in the future, and you're married. Okay. And you're working nonstop, and the bank account is flush, and you're driving the new vehicle, and you haven't talked to your wife in a month and a half. How happy is she going to be?
If I hadn't talked to her in about a month and a half, I probably wouldn't be coming home anymore, right? In fear of my own life.
And I mean, it's like, don't sacrifice family. It's like there's a time to work, and there's a time to stop working, and the Lord has always recognized that fact.
Yeah. There's even an example of that in the Old Covenant where in Deuteronomy 4, verse 5, there's one of the laws regarding marriage, and it's that if someone was newly married and took a wife, he could not be in the military and he could not be conscripted into public service for a year. because that time was going to be set aside so that he could have that time with his family rather than just being forced into service.
Yeah. And nearby that passage in Deuteronomy 5, I understand we're not under the old law.
Sure.
And we understand that. But at the same time, there are concepts and principles. And one of the things in the Old Testament that they took real seriously, that the Lord took real seriously, was the Sabbath. And the very fact that he says, do your work in 6 days. Do not work on that seventh day. And that whole idea for those, because of course, what would Israel do? They would try to work all 7 days. It's like, okay, go gather the manna on 6 days. There's not going to be any manna on the seventh day. And what do? They go out and they try to gather manna on the seventh day. And it showed a lack of faith. And I mean, we're talking about work. Well, a part of the conversation about work also needs to be a conversation about faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, listen, there are a lot of people in the world who work a whole lot harder than any of us do, and they have nothing to show for it. I mean, as far as very little. And there needs to be a recognition that even in our work and there is faith and there is grace and there is gratitude towards God and a balance of all these things. Concerning the Sabbath, the verse that I wanted to read, this is Deuteronomy chapter 5. And as it talks about the Sabbath, and it says, and remember, this is verse 15, and remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with mighty hand, by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. One of the points is, it's like, you're not a slave anymore. Stop acting like a slave.
Mm-hmm. Stop
working yourself to the bone. You're not a slave. You've been set free. And it's like, we serve the Lord. Is there a time to work? Absolutely, there's a time to work. Is there a time to stop working, stop sacrificing our family, and also, I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about church as well and our spiritual family.
Right. You know, that idea of not being a slave anymore. I know in one of our recent Bible classes, I think you, John, brought up in the New Covenant where it talks about one who has become a Christian should not make themselves a slave to someone else. Right. So how many people today are they just put themselves completely under the push and pull of their employer or their job. And, you know, it's, well, I can't make it to Bible study because, you know, I got to do this, or the boss needs me to do this, or the job, you know, the company really, really needs me to do this. And, you know, we have to ask ourselves, you know, who's making the decisions in our lives? Who's running our lives if we're that deep into things where we start to see it as there's no choice. We have to do this.
And I will say, we should not act like slaves. We also recognize our employers, while they are our bosses, for lack of a better way of putting it. Can you tell your boss no? Do you have that legal right? If they, you know, I think there are OSHA laws that you cannot work more than 14 days in a row or something like that. But most bosses, we should be able to, and we should have the initiative that if our boss asks us, we should be able to say no. And I think if you're going to have a good work life, if you're going to have a good balance, okay, well, what does that mean you're going to have to do at some point? You're going to have to say no to something or someone so that you can say yes to something else.
Yeah.
Now understand, sometimes people may be in a situation like the slaves of old where you ain't going to be able to tell them no. And you do the best you can. But in the situations we're talking about, we should not be afraid to tell our employer no. My son, 16 years old, just got a job at Dairy Queen, right? Go boy. And he told them going into it, I'm not going to be able to work Wednesday and I'm not going to be able to work Sunday.
Yep. I've definitely had to do that before.
And I mean, he was upfront with them, and they said, okay, we'll work around it. Now, if he would not have said anything, what would they have done?
Probably scheduled him Sunday nights because nobody ever wants to work on Sunday nights.
Exactly. So he had to have some backbone and say, I'm not going to work at this point. I will work these other days, but this day is the Lord's day, and I'm not going to work that day. And that's what we have to do. What other points would we make, Andrew?
Yeah, so we talked about greed. We talked about neglecting of family, and neglecting of kind of our spiritual responsibilities. I guess something I was thinking about was sometimes we may even use work as sort of a way to hide from other problems, or if we have issues we don't want to face. Sometimes people bury themselves in their work as a way to get out of it. And, I can't deal with that because I've got all this work to do.
Marital issues, so you'd rather go to work.
Yeah. And
it happens.
People will start choosing, there's problems at work, and there's work problems, but sometimes people will start choosing that stress over other stresses that they'd rather not deal with that are more important to their spiritual health.
Yeah. And if we do that, this is why we need the Lord. It's like there has to be a balance. The Lord understands there's a time to work, but we have to recognize work. And the thing is, the Lord, everywhere you turn, the Lord is there. And I made this point recently in a sermon. You have verses about, servants. We should obey. What is it? Not with, how does it phrase it?
Are you talking about in Colossians 3, where it says, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord."
Right, as unto the Lord. So, lo and behold, when you go to work, guess what? The Lord is there. Mm-hmm. There are directions for there. When there are problems at home, the Lord is there. The church, obviously the Lord is there. The Lord is, it's not like we compartmentalize and say, this is work life, this is family life, God's over there. That's not how this works. But there is a recognition, there's a time to work, there's time for family, and there's time for our brethren as well. I think some of the verses that have to be considered, one is Luke chapter 14 in the parable of the Great Supper, when everybody starts making excuses. The invitation goes out, and the excuses are, I bought oxen, I need to go have them tested. I bought land, I need to go see it. And I've married a wife, I'm not coming. And it's just excuses. Mm-hmm. Is there a time to buy land? Okay. Is there a time to test your oxen? Okay. You married a wife. Why don't you bring her with you? The invitation was sent out. And it's just excuses. We better make sure we're putting, and this is where I think, your introductory comments about your workplace talks a lot about work balance. But probably in this day and age, do they say things like, put God first?
There's no religious context to any of the instruction.
I know where I used to work in years gone by. I don't know if they still do. There's a factory in Crawfordsville, but they would say Lord first. They'd say God first, family second, work third. So there was a recognition there. But it's like, no excuses. The Lord is foundational. So, you have those excuses being given, and it's, no, we have to serve the Lord in all these things. I think if you want to talk about a workaholic, I don't know too many people in Scripture who would be a better candidate for that than Solomon. Solomon, it pretty much says, it's like whatever his heart wanted, he went after it. And it's like he's going after it with gusto.
Right.
And just that verse, whatever his heart wanted, that's what he went after.
And unlike almost anyone who's come after had the means to have that lifestyle, I think plenty of people would try to do that if they didn't run out of money before they got there.
Yeah. And to just look at Solomon, and it is a wonderful example. He's a wonderful example of those who desire to be rich fall into a snare, and they pierce themselves through with many sorrows. Here Solomon is, and whatever he wanted, he went after, and he's the same guy who writes Ecclesiastes. It's vanity, it's grasping for the wind. And it's like, when you die, who gets it? Well, could be any number of people. But he says you can't take it with you.
Yeah. I think these are all hard things too, especially for young people, like me and Grant, because we look at the way we work, we look at what we're doing. Sorry, John.
I'm not young.
Sorry, John, you're not.
Well, you deemed yourself not a young person.
I'm officially middle-aged.
But for people like us, sometimes we might find it harder to think about our life in the context of the long term like that. And it's a lot more easy for us to think about the short term and the next year maybe, but our long term planning is maybe not so informed. So it's passages like that really, I think, can help people who maybe haven't made all those mistakes yet. They can learn from someone else who has. Someone who maybe hasn't.
Yeah, I think that's why it's included in Scripture.
Absolutely.
It's
someone
like,
who hasn't
right.
spent all their time, poured it into a job that then they get old and they realize they don't know their kids. They don't have a good relationship with their wife. They're not involved with their church family. There's so many things that they've had to set aside to get the promotion or to get the salary that they wanted. And, sure, now they have the house, the car, the boat, but they don't get to keep it. It won't be theirs forever.
Right.
And people realize that late in life if they haven't given the time to think about what are your priorities going to be before you even start working, before you even begin. I think you mentioning Steve starting his job was a good point. Think about these things before you even get into, the pattern of that kind of thing. Think about it before you even start, your next job or you start your next role if you get a promotion. Decide beforehand what are the limits going to be and what are the priorities going to be.
Yeah. And like you said, you can have the boat, you can have the house, you can have this, and what have you given up? Solomon, how many times does Solomon talk about better to be in the corner of a rooftop than with a contentious woman? He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. When he says things like that, it's like, yeah, he had a lot of stuff. Was he happy? I don't know about that.
I don't think he could name all his children,
yeah.
much less name all his wives.
Yeah, and they turned his heart away from the Lord. His wives did, and not a good situation. Grant, you had what was one of the verses you had? It was, what will a man give?
Mark. Are you talking about Mark?
Yeah.
Mark 8:36. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's it in a nutshell, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, you can have everything, but what will a man give? And it's like, you're not taking it with you. To think about the parable of the foolish farmer. Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. The Lord said to him that night, he says, this night your soul will be required of you. That fellow who had so much, how much would he have given up at that point when the Lord says, your soul's required of you tonight? He would have given anything up.
Oh, yeah.
At that point. Before that, he wasn't. It was all about the stuff. The rich man and Lazarus, he's in torment. And he says, effectively, he would be content if Lazarus just came and dipped his finger in water and touched it to his tongue. And it's like, he had no time for Lazarus before. He was content with his riches, clothed in purple, and he didn't have time for Lazarus. But it's a sad thing when people, they live for riches.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they won't call it that. It's just work for them.
Yeah.
For them, it's just work.
Or maybe they'll say, I want to make something to pass on to my children. I want to, ensure that my family's provided for. And those are noble things, but...
And scriptural things as well. It talks about inheritance and things like that.
But if you do that to the point where you've given your children a monetary inheritance at the cost of what is their spiritual inheritance. I'm not saying that our faith is inherited or that our salvation is inherited, but if they haven't had any of that foundation from their parents teaching them, spending that time with them to show them what is important, it's not worth whatever money you leave behind for them.
If I work, granted I'm a preacher, but if I work at a factory and I'm working all the time and I don't fulfill the verse in Ephesians, fathers, raise your children in the training and admonition of the Lord. If I don't do that, I may leave them a big fat inheritance, but I certainly haven't left them with godliness. And it's like, because I've sacrificed them. Mm-hmm. I have given them up in the name of money. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work in the grand scheme of things, but that's how the world is, unfortunately. Any other verses or ideas we need to think about? I think one thing might be just to close out. I think a person needs to ask themselves why they are working and just what is motivating them to work. You know, we've talked about seeing to our own needs. Well, there is a difference between seeing to your own needs and selfishness. There's a difference.
Right.
So what motivates a person? So we could talk about, you know, we need to think about our needs, but also we have verses about if you don't see to your own family, you're worse than an unbeliever. I need to see to my family's needs. And as we get older, how old are your parents, Andrew? They're in their 50s?
Yeah.
And I think...
I don't think I'm legally allowed to say it on the air.
I think are they in their 80s?
Pretty close.
No, they're not. They're not.
No, I think
they're not that old. My point is, as they get older, as their children, we will have a responsibility to care for them. I have a responsibility to care for my parents. So that's a good motivator to work. Not to overwork, but this is about, if I will be, back to Andrew's point about appetite, if I will not allow my appetite to get out of hand, if I will be content with a little, it will allow me to take care of my family, perhaps my more extended family, and then we start thinking about sharing with others. Mm-hmm. Was it last week we talked about charity?
Yeah.
Or in a recent episode, we talked about charity. So now we've moved beyond ourselves, beyond our family, and we're talking about others. And we could talk about, you know, church and benevolence and individual benevolence. Those are good motivators. And those are the things we should be setting our sight on. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying life. God has richly given us all things to enjoy. But if we're like Solomon and it's just whatever we want, we're going after it. Frankly, we may have the boat, but we have missed the boat.
Yeah, and I think we'll find that the less we make provision for our own satisfaction, we can be satisfied in what we can give to other people, what we can provide for other people. And, you know, if we know that, hey, maybe we got passed up for the promotion because the boss thought that us saying no to certain things that were asked of us because we set some limits, maybe we get passed up for that promotion. Whatever we miss out because of that, it's probably not going to satisfy us in the long run like it will knowing that we were focused on spiritual matters and doing what was right before God.
Very much so.
And even maybe getting passed up for the promotion will allow you to maintain that work-life balance type of ordeal.
You might have better relationships.
The Lord can see when maybe the thing we need is to be humbled and to be taught to be satisfied with a little, rather than constantly have our wants granted in giving us more.
Even Paul, when he says, I have learned how to be abased, and I've learned how to abound. I can do all things. We are content, and we have to learn contentment. So that's what the episode's been about. Grant, appreciate you being on here, dude.
It was great.
Yeah,
it was fun.
Yep, thanks for being on here. Andrew, hope you have a good week.
Will do.
Take care of yourself. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. Appreciate you having ears to hear. We hope you tune in next week. Thanks for being with us.